Today I'll be showing you how to make a fully rigged and animated dynamic head. I will also be covering how I created the shrinking eye effect for my dynamic heads. Firstly, I want to thank Shine on YouTube because I learned how to make these from her, and also I got the template from her Discord server. If for whatever reason the link below is not working, I also have the templates in a Mediafire. So once you open up the file, it should look like this. The first thing you'd want to do is go into edit mode, and you're going to use L on your keyboard to select and delete the red parts of the face because we're going to make our own. Now we're going to go into edit mode on the armature, and we're going to select and delete every single bone except for that tiny bone next to the large head bone. This bone is called the root face joint, and it's extremely important later on in rigging. Now use Shift D to duplicate the head, and now we're going to draw our face texture. I'm creating this head for one of my OCs, so I already had a design in mind. This texture will be temporary, so you just know where everything goes when modeling. This is not the final texture you will use in your UV. Alternatively, if you already have a 2D face that you want to turn into a 3D dynamic head, you could just import the OBJ into Blender instead. So now that we're back in Blender, let's actually remove this blue tint. This is just showing the direction of the normal, so we can close that in this menu. Now go to the object properties and disable the wireframe in the viewport display. And now we can add our image by going into materials, making a new one, and in preview and base color, we could choose an image texture. And now obviously our face is a little small, so we're going to edit the UV just to place this correctly. By scaling and transforming the UV, you can control where you want the face to be. Next, this is very important, you're going to want to cut off half of the head so that you can mirror one side. It doesn't matter which side you choose, but when you add the mirror modifier, just make sure it comes first in the hierarchy and turn on merge. I like working with this flat shading viewport, however, you can miss a lot of weird artifacts that happen, like for example here, there's a weird crease in the middle. If this happens to you, you just want to go into the data properties and you will clear the custom split normals data under geometry. This specific example was a little harder to notice, but this is what you would do if you have any weird shading going on. Now it's time to actually make your head. So using the loop cut feature, you can slide and drag, adding new edge vertices to any part of your head. The goal here is to add enough vertices that allow for clean deformation, but not too many that it becomes a hassle when rigging. Now you'll notice when you try to move the vertices, the texture will stretch. So instead of moving things normally, you'll need to use edge slide by pressing G twice. This will allow your UVs to correct themselves while also maintaining the texture. If this is not working, just make sure you have correct UVs checked in the corner. Now it's about lining up each of your vertices with your face texture. One thing to really keep in mind is align your vertices with where you're going to cut the eye socket out. So this is generally below the eyelash line and above the lower eyelash line. So once you've got your eyes carved out and you've removed the faces on the inside, we're going to create the eye socket. So by selecting the edge and extruding it inwards, we can kind of resize it and also extrude it again to create kind of a pocket that goes on the inside of the head. By creating eyes like this, you can make that following eyes effect that a lot of dynamic heads have. To fill the gap at the end, I use grid fill. Now make sure you have shade auto smooth turned on if you don't already. If the auto smooth is smoothing too much, you're going to want to go inside edit mode and select the edge of the eye and mark that as sharp. As for the crease down the middle of the head, just set your merge on your mirror modifier to a very small number and that should go away. When creating the eyelashes, you want to select the outer edge of vertices along the eye, duplicate that, and extrude it outwards. And now usually what I do with this is I will separate it so it's in its own object, and then you just kind of model it from there. I personally don't really have many tips for this, it just depends on the style of eyelash you want to go for. It's up to you whether you want to make an eyelash go outwards or stay flat against the head. Either way, you'll need to be thinking about how you want your eye to deform when it blinks, because this is arguably the most important expression you will have to configure. I tend not to stress too much about the shape of the eyelash, because even though it looks clunky right here, we're going to add auto smooth later, and you can always tweak the shape whenever you'd like. So once you got your shape for the upper eyelash, just follow the same directions for the lower eyelash. So once again, you want to go to edit mode on the main head and then select the edge of vertices that are along the lower eyelash and then duplicate that, extrude it, and then make it its own object. Feel free to add as many edge loops as you need, however, it is highly recommended to make sure your vertices line up correctly. Otherwise, this will bite you in the butt later when we do rigging. The same principle also applies to the eyebrows and also the eyelid. I also like adding this aerosol, I think it's called. It's mostly a stylistic choice. You really don't have to add it, but I think it's cute. Once I'm comfortable with the shape, I go in with a little bit of proportional editing just to smooth it out a little more. And then I apply auto smooth. So this makes it not look chunky and weird. Depending on the version of Blender you're using, you'll have to either go into the modifier tab to adjust the angle that it smooths to, or the data tab. Now I like to go into edit mode to make sure all my vertices are aligned like I said before. Now to create the irises, I just insert a circle, reduce the number of vertices, and then scale it down using proportional editing to make it into the shape I want. To get the following eyes effect, you need to position the iris not at the very front of the head. To get the shrinking eye effect from my dynamic head, I actually have the iris rigged so that it goes into the eye white when the eyebrows are raised. So I'm just trying to test that here and make sure that the transition is smooth. With the mouth itself, I'm just adding edge loops similar to how I made the eye sockets. Keep in mind you don't actually have to make a mouth like this. You can pass validation with a closed mouth as well, you just have to be clever when rigging, and I'll show you how to do that. When I was making my head, the teeth was a curved plane and then the tongue was built from a circle. This is also a good time to check your normals. If you see anything that's red, just make sure to flip them so that they become blue. So once you're happy with everything, we can begin UV unwrapping, but actually before you do that, make sure your whole thing is joined into one object. I actually didn't do this and I was struggling later down the line. So just remember to Control J all your meshes together. Once they're together, check to make sure your triangle count is not above 4K. Use Mark Seam to mark edges that you want to be on their own islands on the UV. Things like the eye socket edges, the mouth edge, also each individual eyelash as well. When it comes to customizing the skin color for Roblox, those parts are actually transparent on the texture, so you don't need to dedicate any amount of space on the UV for that. I'd recommend you actually making the biggest part of your UV the iris, because that's where most detail will go. Of course, there's exceptions to this, like face tattoos or blush, so just make sure you format your UV what suits your needs best. Now I just screenshot my UV, line it up in a canvas in Procreate, and I'm going to lower the brightness of the image of the UV and actually change the layer mode to screen. This way when I draw underneath, I can actually see the color and the UV at the same time. Even though, like I mentioned before, the skin color is going to be transparent on the texture, I'm going to give my texture a skin color just temporarily, because I don't know why, Blender doesn't handle it very well. So I'd recommend having a temporary skin color in there on a separate layer so you can remove it later on. When you're done, just make a new material in Blender and then add it as an image texture. And if you did all that, give yourself a pat on the back because you just finished probably the hardest part of this entire thing. Go into edit mode and make sure you can actually select every single part of your thing still, even though they're part of the same object. Also make sure your mirror modifier is still active. You don't actually want to apply that until we do the facial expressions. Now go into edit mode on your armature and select the root face joint next to the head. Now duplicate this and drag it and align it to the iris. Now locate the bone and rename it to whatever it's responsible for. In this case, it's the left iris. Keep in mind when naming left and right for rigging, it's always the character's left side, not the viewer's left side. Since our face is actually symmetrical, we can just go ahead, duplicate that bone, rename it accordingly to the right side, enable mirror, and then just grab the bone, and then it should snap automatically to the exact position on the other side. Now when it comes to rigging the rest of the face, duplicate those bones and then move them to wherever you want to have control. And yes, placement of these bones do indeed matter. You'd usually want one bone per one vertex. If you're making a closed mouth like this, you'll still need upper and lower lip bones. However, you could just have them really close to each other and weight painted to the exact same part. If you have a bone that's in the middle of something, like for example in the mouth here, you can just delete the other bone and then move it to the middle. Once you got all the bones you want, go into side view and make sure they all line up with their correct areas. And now it's time to name them all. It really doesn't matter what you choose to name them. I kind of go with whatever is responsible for, like upper eyelid, 1, 2, 3. Just make sure you have no duplicates and that your left and right are correct. According to the ROBLOX documentation, you have to have all of these facial control bones as children of the root face joint. So select all your new bones and then your root face joint, and then press Ctrl P and parent keep offset. Now all your new bones should be underneath the root face joint in the hierarchy. Next, select your mesh and go into the data tab and delete all the current vertex groups. Now with the head selected, shift select the armature and then parent with empty groups. Now we're ready to weight paint. For For objects like the iris, where you want the bone to deform the whole thing, go into edit mode, select the object, and then find its respective bone. In this case, for me, it's called L iris. Once you have it selected, change the weight to 1 and then click assign. You can test to make sure it's working in pose mode. To weight paint the rest of the face, you can go into edit mode, hide anything you don't want to touch so far, and then select the armature and then the mesh, and then go into weight paint. By doing it this way, you can actually be in pose mode and work on weight painting at the same time. Here you can see what I mean by having your vertices lined up with your bones is extremely useful. With these lash clusters, you want to have the whole lash painted red for that one bone to make sure it doesn't deform strangely. Now I realized I wanted to add another bone in the tongue, so if you do want to go back and add in more bones at this point, you can. You also need to assign the root face joint and the head bone to everything that is not painted. Assign everything above the mouth to the root face joint and assign everything below the mouth to the head. After doing this, you might need to go back in and re-weight paint some things, but it shouldn't be an issue. Your end goal is to have the head bone be able to move your entire head without any weird deformations. Go into the object properties of your mesh and delete all the custom properties. Inside of the file, there should be a top portion with a script. This script will create a custom property that assigns each frame of the timeline into one of these poses called facts. The 25 that you absolutely must have are already in the script, however you can add up to 50. If you want to add more, just copy and paste one of the lines, change the name and the frame number. The more you add, the more expressive your head can be. I'm using this head for a lot more than just in-game in Roblox, so I added 43. You absolutely do not need this many. If you don't even have the inside of your mouth, you don't need tongue out, etc. Once you have all the facts you want in your scripts, you can run the script. You can make sure it worked by going back into object properties and checking the custom properties. At this point, you can finally apply your mirror modifier. Just make sure that all the mirroring actually works. Now you can start with your first expression, which is a blink. You might have to go back in and change some of your weight painting as you go because there can be gaps that form. This is really normal. I suggest you pay a lot of attention to your blink because this is the most common expression that your character will be able to make. So you can actually just test the blink itself by spacing out the keyframes and kind of previewing what it'd look like. I'd also recommend turning your lighting to studio so you can see any weird creases and artifacts that form when your blink is happening, so you can fix those. Once I'm happy with how my eye blinks, I'm actually going to begin setting up the facts. Each frame on your timeline will correspond to a different facial expression, and you can figure out what these ones are by referencing the ROBLOX documentation. Keep in mind you do not need to key any of the body bones or even the head bone. You only need to key the root face joint and all of the extra face bones that you've created. Another thing to keep in mind is that you have to model your face already in the neutral position. This is the biggest mistake I made personally because I created the mouth very open, but I actually wanted it to look a little bit more closed. And despite the facts having frame 0 as a neutral position, this didn't actually apply in game. So I needed to go back into pose mode and change my resting pose to form the neutral position I wanted to. Another very important thing, do not use scale to transform any bones. Roblox does not take scale well when doing rigging. Here's some proof. So yeah, only use rotation and location when doing transformations, never touch scale. Usually what I do when I'm setting up my facial expressions is I'll change a little bit more than what's required. For example, for my upper eyelid raise facts, I would shrink the iris by making it go back into the eye socket, as well as raise the eyebrows a little bit, so it has all that expression in just one move. So once you're happy with all your expressions, now we can move on to literally, I think, the worst and most frustrating part of the whole process. Go into your file and then append, and then look for the cage and append the cage mesh. And now you can just resize it to try to fit your head as best as possible. Make sure when you're transforming this in edit mode, you have mirror turned on so that it's symmetrical. Almost all of validation errors will come from a cage that Roblox doesn't see as working. So you need to pay attention to these areas especially. I would highly recommend reading up on the ROBLOX documentation. Although it is quite sparse, you still get a lot of information from here. A good cage is honestly any cage that works. Try to make your cage fit as tightly as possible to your head mesh without clipping through. If you're having a really hard time with this, I also have one of my previously working cages for one of my old heads linked in the description along with the other files in case you need to use that. Just make sure you edit it to fit your head as needed. Remember to not add any extra loop cuts by accident. This will give you a UV error and you'll need to restart. Last thing you need to make sure before exporting is that your cage mesh is parented to the cage empty. You also need to make sure it's under the correct name. So when your cage is looking nice and snug, it's time to export. And get ready because this is probably not going to be your last time doing it. Roblox is extremely particular on how your file is set up. Before even hitting export, check to make sure your hierarchies are set up correctly. This means that your cage is underneath the cage empty, your head and cage are named correctly, and also that your joints are in the correct order. If all of that looks good, go ahead and export FBX. The settings you need to have are active collection, custom properties, disable leaf bones, and then uncheck these 3 in animation. Now finally change your scale to 0.1 for these final 2 settings. Now just give it a sec. Now you can import your file into Studio. With your file selected, go to Setup in the Avatar section and you should be met with this screen. If you're not, then just make sure you actually do have the custom properties exported. Now go into Check Face and look at your range of motion for each of these presets. If anything looks terribly wrong, you'll need to go back in and fix your facts. Something like this is very common if you tend to make your expressions do too much. For example, if the fax calls for jaw drop, if you're moving the corners of the mouth to the side as well, despite that being the job of mouth left, mouth right, then you're going to be setting up your mouth to do basically double the movement. By the way, if you import and you see some foreign objects, you can just uncheck them when you're importing. To have your head ready for upload, you have to add the face attachments. So just grab a random Roblox rig, copy these 4 attachments from the head, and then paste them into your head. Now your head is properly all set up. When you're uploading your head, make sure you put your texture in the surface appearance section, where it calls for a color map. Do not put it into the actual head mesh texture ID. When you think you're ready to upload, give it a try. Save export to Roblox, avatar item, head, and oh, look at that. It's not good. So that brings us to troubleshooting. When it comes to troubleshooting, unfortunately, the ROBLOX documentation is your best friend. However, I've encountered some errors that I can give advice on. If you see a UV error, it means you've accidentally messed up the UV of your cage. If it says cannot detect blank, such as a blink, open mouth, frown, etc., you need to edit your cage. If it cannot detect a blink, make sure to check that your cage positions of the vertices are not positioned on the eye itself, but on the eyelid. Same for the mouth. Make sure the vertices of the cage are above the vertices of the head that are actually moving. If whatever you do with your cage is not working, you might want to build your cage from an already working one. I have one linked in the description like mentioned earlier. Troubleshooting for dynamic heads just consists of you re-exporting your FBX until you get a correct validation. This can be a pretty frustrating process, admittedly, so don't give up. And after all that, you now have a cool dynamic head you can use.